Welcome, everybody, to a very special Friday episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I am so looking forward to this interview today, as anybody who's been reading my social media posts can probably attest. Stephen Mitchell, who's on the show today, is one of my personal heroes and has been very formative to me in my own kind of spiritual searching. And his work, I think, as a whole, has provided a real map for my own spiritual quests. So this is a real honor, and it's frankly one of the reasons why I do this show. But before we get to Stephen, a few words about the show. We're live streaming on Facebook and YouTube on A Mighty Blaze. We're here always to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. A Mighty Blaze, if you didn't know, is an online broadcast network that connects writers and readers virtually. At A Mighty Blaze, we're all volunteer. We're never asking for money. If you want to show us the love, just comment or repost or tell your friends about us. But if you are in the mood to spend money, I have an idea for you. You could spend it on translations of the world's most enduring spiritual literature and much of its greatest poetry, all of it created by a singular voice and one of the most innovative and fresh and best-selling translators of our time. That is Stephen Mitchell. If you'd like to buy any of his books, we're going to link to a page on his website, which shows you all the books that he's done. And if you have a comment or you'd like to ask Stephen a question, we'll get to those at the end of the show. Just pop them in the chat and they'll make their way to me. Now, a little bit more about today's guest. Stephen Mitchell is a towering figure in the world of spiritual literature and translation. His poetic, interpretive editions of such classics as the Tao Te Ching, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Beowulf, the Book of Job, the Bhagavad Gita, the Psalms, the Gospels, the Book of Genesis, and Homer have sold over 1 million copies and offered a generation of English speakers access to the beauty and mystery of the world's most profound spiritual texts. Stephen has twice won the Harold Morton Landon Translation Award from the Academy of American Poets. He is equally well known for his translations of poets like Rilke and Neruda. And earlier this year, he put out a translation of the Roman poet Catullus. The Chicago Tribune called Mitchell's translation of Rilke the most beautiful group of poetic translations of the 20th century. All told, he's published over 30 books, drawing upon nearly every religious tradition, culture, geography, and era of mankind. In Stephen's own introduction to Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, he described Rilke's work as dense, rich, and full of inexhaustible nourishment. That is very much how I feel personally about Stephen's own work. I myself has been reading his work for my entire adult life. His Epic of Gilgamesh, his Bhagavad Gita, and his Tao Te Ching are among my favorite books I've ever read. I've read each of them dozens of times. And in many ways, I feel like I've been preparing my whole life just to do this interview. So Stephen, it is an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for coming on The Thoughtful Bro.
Oh, you're so welcome, Mark. That was a very kind introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, you are so welcome. So I have so much that I want to get through today. I mean, I was saying to you before we got on air that I could do an hour talking to you about just one of your books, and obviously there's 30 and more of them. But I think today I'd like to take the approach of kind of talking about, your approach as a translator and kind of your overall and kind of what working on all these great spiritual classics has meant to you and what it maybe helps you see about our world today and the spirituality and the spiritual quest of our world in the 21st century. So to start, Stephen, you, I guess, effectively are a translator. Obviously, it's what you're known for, but I'm just curious, do you feel like translator is how you describe yourself?
Sure, it's a lot of what I've done. If people ask me what I am as a profession, I say writer because it includes everything. I've done, as you mentioned, many translations, but I've also written nonfiction books. I've written fiction, and I've also been the co-writer of my wife's amazing books, Byron Katie's Loving What Is, and 1,000 Names for Joy and A Mind at Home with Itself. So writer just includes that all, and it's the simplest way.
Yeah. I think, when you look at the totality of your work and sort of how big these projects are and kind of how ambitious the oeuvre is when you look at the whole scope of it, I guess one question that comes to mind right off the top of my head is how you choose what you're going to work on. And I know that, Rilke, who is a favorite of yours, and you've done such great work with him, he talks about like the obedience of the spirit. And you've talked about a kind of almost erotic pull and attraction toward a work. I guess I'm just wondering, like, is there something that weaves it all together? Is there maybe a type of book that you could define as something that usually draws your attention?
I don't know how to define it except to say that I feel a deep affinity with something. And it doesn't have to do necessarily with the quality of the writing, because there's a lot of great writing, a lot of great poetry that I have very little affinity with. So I don't make these decisions. The decisions are made for me. And if something pops up and I feel very attracted to it, then I'll decide to spend a year with it, or 18 years with it, as I spent with the Book of Job, or 4 months as I spent with the Tao Te Ching. It's just that, I was very lucky to have many years of Zen training under my belt. So when something popped up, I was immediately, in my mind, I was immediately aware of it and knew what to do as a next step. So it's kind of like that.
I heard you say in a different interview that, I think it was working on the Gospels, maybe after the Tao Te Ching, you said you wanted to clarify a confusion within yourself. Is that part of the attraction as well? That it's like you see there's something mysterious or that you don't quite grasp in the work, and you actually want to translate it just as a way of coming to terms with that yourself?
Exactly. So all the books I write are for me. And then if other people like them, that's just a bonus. But I found that in my experience, if I'm really enthusiastic about something, a lot of people are. But I have two stories, if you have the time.
Please.
To kind of give you examples of how these things work. So the first one is the first translation project that I ever got involved with, which was the Book of Job. And here's how that happened. I was 22 years old. My first girlfriend, whom I loved very much, dumped me. And so this was the beginning of all my creative path. So I couldn't find any way to deal with the pain in my heart. And I had no idea about any other spiritual traditions besides Western religion. So I tried to look within the Bible for some kind of help, some way out. And the passage that most connected with me was the end of the Book of Job, where God, or it's actually it's not a God, it's bigger than a God figure, but let's call it God, appears to Job, and in this magnificent oration presents before him the energy of the natural world, animals and even frightening animals. It's all part of God's creative energy, which is beyond good and evil, and it makes the book an amazing statement of something that the rest of the Bible doesn't know about. And I felt that the poet who wrote the Book of Job had seen something that I desperately needed myself, and that if I could somehow understand this voice from the whirlwind at the end of Job, that I would be able to deal with the pain in my heart. So I started to read it over and over in the King James Version, and then I realized that if I wanted to get intimate with it, I would have to learn Hebrew or relearn Hebrew. And then when I got about a year into it, I realized I'd have to learn biblical scholarship because the text was a bit of a mess. Then comparative ancient Near Eastern languages. One thing led to another. So I had to learn a lot to do a good job with it. But so I spent 6 years translating it so that I could get closer and have my answer to what in the world is going on at the end of this book. And I woke up one morning and realized that I wasn't any closer to it after 6 years, although I had been translating it in a way that nobody had done before, which was into English verse, because nobody had recognized that the Hebrew is actually verse form. So I decided I wasn't any closer. I'd have to go to India to meet an enlightened master like Ramana Maharshi, whom I loved and respected totally. So I started to learn Hindi, and before I was ready to leave for India, a friend of mine said, before you go, you should check out this Zen master, or at least he says he's a Zen master. He's in Rhode Island, and he has very strange eyes. So I went down, I knocked on his door, I sat at his kitchen table, I looked into his eyes, and it seemed to me that he knew that answer. He knew that place where everything is beautiful, everything is filled with energy, and good and evil are just lesser considerations. So I stayed with him, and after a year, I had my answer from the whirlwind, and I really understood that. So I could begin in good conscience to go deeper into the book. And 18 years later, after my girlfriend dumped me, I met her again, and it was the most beautiful meeting, and she's
Oh
still
my
a
gosh.
dear friend. So it all ended up really in a quite miraculous way.
That's a beautiful story, Stephen. And if I could, I mean, you said that you struggled for so long to understand the meaning of the world when you had an instinct. If you understood what was happening at the end of the book of Job, you'd be able to understand this grief you had over your broken heart. So could you, to the extent that you could articulate it here rather than having us just go read your translation, like what did you ultimately come to understand after 18 years?
Well, I love that question, and I can't answer it. The way because the way I answered it in the introduction to my Job was, I spent so many years feeling mute that it was beyond me. I wasn't mature enough. I wasn't intelligent enough to really talk about it. And then there came a moment when I felt I was ready. This was already like 15 years into the process. So I don't want to spoil that by giving a half-baked summary of it. If people are interested, um, there's really no other way but to read that essay.
Right. Okay. So, if I could also ask you about, kind of looking at all of your work together, Stephen. I mean, this is like the seven summits of literature, if you will. I mean, the seven summits being the seven tallest mountains on each continent. I mean, these are some of the most debated, read. I mean, there's billions of readers for this book, both these books, both now and all through history. And I guess I see an ambition there as part of your selection process. I mean, you've talked about the kind of attraction you need to have towards something. And I'm just wondering if, like, the grandness of these projects and your ambition to tackle them is part also of what draws you toward them.
The grandness, for sure. Ambition is a word that I don't relate to that well, because the way it comes to me is always so personal. It's something I have to do for myself. Actually, before I start on a book, there always have to be two things that I'm feeling. One is, I can't do this. I'm not smart enough. I'm not spiritually mature enough. It's just beyond me. And the second thing is, I have to do this. So holding those in harmony for me is the signal that this is the next thing on my agenda. I told you I had two stories.
Oh yeah.
If you're ready for the second,
Please.
this has to do with a book I wrote. It came out in 1991 called The Gospel According to Jesus. And this story goes way back in my life to when I was 9 years old. And I grew up in a not very observant Reform Jewish family in Brooklyn. And we would go to synagogue once a year, maybe twice at the outset, at the utmost. And so I had something of a Jewish awareness and identity by the time I was in fifth grade. My parents sent me to private school starting in the 5th grade because our local public school had a really bad reputation. And in the private school, it was a nominally Christian school. We were obligated to go to chapel every Tuesday. And the headmaster would get up and give a little talk and pick a gospel passage. And Jesus fascinated me. Sometimes I really couldn't understand what was going on. But when I could understand, I was very, very attracted to what he was saying. One day, about 5 weeks into the 5th grade, my teacher took me aside. I should say that I was in love with my 5th grade teacher. One day, when I raised my hand, I embarrassed myself deeply by calling her mommy.
Oh gosh.
It was a terrible moment for me, but I was in love with her, and she took me aside and said, "I've noticed that you haven't been singing, reciting the Lord's Prayer along with the other boys. Why not?" So I said to her, "Well, I'm Jewish. I don't think that I'm allowed to." And she said, "Oh, but the words of Jesus are for all people." So that gave me some kind of permission to feel the attraction that I was feeling. And then later in the year, I got much more involved with Willie Mays than with Jesus. And I wasn't interested again till I got to college. When I got to college, I started being very confused by some of the sayings of Jesus, some of the nastier ones or the more violent ones. And I was baffled by how somebody who seemed to have such a direct contact with the truth could have said these other things. So I began to think about how could that be? How could that be possible? And I thought about it off and on for a while, until after my Tao Te Ching was published and did so well. I thought I had permission to do whatever I wanted with the next book. And my project was to get clear and get beyond my confusion about Jesus. So I started to write it, and I couldn't. I was really blocked, and I didn't understand why. And at that moment, I got an offer from an organization in San Francisco that I'd never heard of, that gave fellowships or scholarships of $10,000, a huge amount to me in those days, and the only requirement was that you go to Israel and spend 3 weeks there. So I said, this is a good deal. And at the same time, in a cafe in Berkeley, I met an Israeli who did tours of the Sinai and of the Galilee, and so I was able to hire him, being so wealthy at that point with the $10,000. He took me to Galilee. We saw the sights. We went kayaking on the Jordan River. We did this, did that, and it wasn't clicking for me. I didn't know why I was there. What was I supposed to learn about Jesus that I wasn't seeing? And after a couple of weeks, he said, "Let me take you to the Sinai Desert." I was stationed there after the 6-day war. I love it. It's beautiful. So we went to the Sinai, and he hired a camel and a camel driver, a Bedouin. We walked off into the desert, and after maybe 10 or 15 minutes, the Bedouin driver said, "I have to stop and pray," one of the 5 times that a Muslim prays. So he was praying and doing his full prostrations to the ground and saying, "Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar." And as I looked at him, I was astonished because I saw a surrender in his body that was so moving that it moved me to tears. And I was almost about to get up and bow along with him. I was so moved. I thought this was such genuine surrender. But then it occurred to me that I would freak him out being a Jew. So I decided to do that in my mind. And then the next day, he took us, my Israeli friend and me, into his private garden in the desert, where he grows vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. And then he introduced me to his children. and made a sandwich of the Western food we had brought. They were all fascinated with that. And then one after another, from 3 years old to 15 years old, they came up to their father, got their food, kissed him, went back to their places. And I was in awe of this. I had never seen the kind of reverence for a father that these children were showing, but it also went along with a huge, a deep respect. And I said to myself, oh, that's what I was missing. That's what Jesus meant by Abba, Father. The figure of like the first hexagram in the I Ching, the creative energy that nourishes and fosters and gives to its children and is totally dependent. This father was that archetypal figure. If you take the word patriarch with all its negative connotations and turn it around as if it were a negative of a film and printed it as a film, you would see this man, this magnificent patriarch. Anyway, so I felt I had my answer, and I went back and wrote the book, and that was it. That's how that got written. It was for me, but it also was for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that there's ambition, then it just seems like there's a great ambition to, complete the next step in your own spiritual odyssey. And each translation is sort of another stone that you've laid, trying to understand some mystery within yourself.
Yeah, that's true to some extent. I feel that after I finished my years of Zen practice, I had understood the essential, and that a lot of these books were ways of giving back from what I had been given through my practice. And then when I met Byron Katie, who became my wife, I discovered an even more powerful practice than meditation. So I was I felt it was a great privilege to help her write those 3 books, because they were the most powerful spiritual tools that I had ever read about or heard about. So there was that too. But you're right in general.
Yeah. Stephen, when I look at your work, it's hard not to feel that such a setting out. I mean, you've done these things now. You've done these translations, but to look back and think that you feel as though you kind of encountered the consciousness of Jesus and kind of explained that, and the consciousness of the Job and what was happening there, and on to these other books. It just seems to me, when I look at all that, I think, wow, it's so daunting. Like, how could a person not be intimidated by it? And I just want to read something that you wrote about Chuang Tzu. You said Chuang Tzu believed had Chuang Tzu believed there was anything to live up to, he would have been too intimidated to try. But there was nothing to live up to. There was only the passion for the genuine, a fascination with words, and a constant awareness that the ancient masters are alive and well in the mind that doesn't know a thing. And I feel like, kind of coming to know you and your Zen practice, this idea of knowing nothing is at least part of your ability to kind of feel free in approaching some of these grand texts.
Yeah, that's very true, and I'm really glad you read that, because that's a passage that is dear to my heart. The Zen master that I studied with for so many years said that he had brought nothing to America but don't know mind. And when you understand that, it's not ignorance. It's the mind that is so open that it doesn't get attached to its own thinking. And that is a major freedom. That's the only freedom, actually. It's not getting stuck in your own opinion and identity. It's so much vaster than that. And when you've practiced it for a while through meditation or through the work of Byron Katie, it's easy to to step into that space.
Mm.
So, you were talking again about ambition. Once I had a project decided for me and entered my mind as something that needed to happen, that was ready to happen, I just took one step and then the next step and then the next step. And, it wasn't a huge project. There wasn't a huge ambition. It was just the daily work. Like, for the Iliad, I had the goal of doing 50 lines a day. And I always did that because I'm a really disciplined person through the Zen practice. And it was easy. It was just like, having a cup of coffee in the morning, just
Yeah.
the next thing. So, it's really when you become intimate with a consciousness that you've been attracted to, um, things become really easy. I've found, and I should also say that some of my translation work is not translation at all. It's improvisation. For example, in the Tao Te Ching, when I came to a chapter that seemed to be written on one of Lao Tzu's off days, maybe at a stomach ache or something, or maybe somebody else wrote it, when it was definitely coming, it seemed to me from a lower level of consciousness, I would toss the text out the window and just improvise on the same theme. And people seem to be very happy with that, except for the Orthodox Taoists. Orthodox Taoist is as silly as a
It's like a contradiction in terms, right?
contradiction, but there are such beings out there.
And just building on this idea of kind of how you approach with such confidence some of these works that are some of the most studied and talked about works in the history of civilization. I've heard you say that you don't struggle with doubt, and that the inner critic is something you have a great experience and you have methods for dealing with. Could you just talk about that? Because I think there's a lot of people who listen to this show who are writers themselves, and I think creative doubt is a major thing that people deal with. But you seem to have a kind of your own way of dealing with it, or a unique way.
Well, I don't have doubt when a project has been given to me, and I know that it's there before I even put down a word of it. I've had that experience with a book, with several books. Doubting, I love doubting during my work, and doubting means that you never stay with something that doesn't seem to you excellent. There is always a sense that you have done a fairly good job, say on a particular line or a particular paragraph, but it's not as riveting as you want it to be. So then you go back. I've done 20 drafts of a book or 30 drafts, and it's not a it's not a difficulty. It's something that you love to do. It's like practicing a piece of music. It's just a delight, but to never compromise with my own standards of excellence. But as far as deciding on a book or doubting my ability to do a book, that can happen because I've already been shown that the book is there. So that's my experience of it.
Yeah. So I want to talk for a moment about your style. First of all, let me ask you, do you feel like you have a style, or do you feel, I mean, obviously you're on some level, you're just dealing with the style of the work that it's written in, but do you feel that your own personal style sort of is always merging with the style of the source text?
I do. And if you ask me what my style is, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I know I have one. I would leave that to somebody else from the outside.
Well, let me say this. I mean, I think the word accessibility is a word that comes up a fair amount. Now, I, as someone who has been told that my work is accessible, it can sometimes seem like that's a backhanded compliment. I mean, to me, it's not. I mean, you're dealing with some.
I love accessibility.
Oh, good. And I'm glad you do, because I certainly do. And I just think it lets people in, and I think you have a wonderful way of having your work be at once, this is the almost the trick of a Stephen Mitchell translation. It is contemporary, and yet it doesn't lose its gravitas. And I think that is so difficult. I think, people feel like religious literature ought to be serious and no fun. And you've sort of avoided that. You make it light, when it deserves lightness. But so, I don't know, I'm just amazed at how you can make it seem like it's language that everybody on earth can easily understand. And yet it just still carries the weight and power of the original, it seems.
Well, that's very kind of you, Mark. And if I've done that job for other readers as I've done it for you, then I'm a happy camper. But when I have permission to be lighthearted and even funny, as with the Shuang Tzu, I love that.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite books that I've done, the second book of the Tao. But then when it comes to Job, that is not for a book. So it's adapting. You want to not be slavishly copying the original author, but to be translating the spirit as well as the letter when you can. But if you have to choose, translating the spirit.
Yeah. There's a wonderful note that was sent to me. This is a friend of mine named Dawn Tripp, and she's a novelist. And Dawn wrote this to me. She said, "Stephen is one of my heroes. His translations of Rilke have meant so much to me over the years. I've for years collected his translation and reflected on how his work strives to capture the essence and the heart of the work. And he understands that the literal is not always where the heart lies." Can you just talk about the emphasis on the spirit rather than the letter? And how do you know when you've really felt like you've captured the essence or spirit of something?
Well, that's the jackpot question. Before I go into that about letter and spirit, I want to you might be interested, tie up another knot or
please.
Another circle. You know that girl who dumped me and I went into the book of Job?
Yeah.
My first girlfriend. She's the one, when we were in Paris together as students, who gave me a French translation of Letters to a Young Poet. First time I'd ever heard of Rilke. And I was so moved by, excuse me, this is something that I hadn't figured out. It's not even my thing. So I was so deeply affected by that. I felt that he was speaking to me in a voice about art and solitude as a positive quality. I had never heard this kind of thing before. So when I got back to college in America, I started to learn German so that I could read him in the original. So bless her heart, that young woman who dumped me gave me Rilke and gave me Job, and I just have thanked her 100 times for that since.
Well, and the fifth grade teacher you had a crush on gave you Jesus, so it's like there's like a heartbreaking story behind everything.
Yeah, I'm very indebted to the women in my life. But as far as spirit and letter, when I translate Rilke or Catullus, I try to use something equivalent to the original form of their verse. So, for instance, when Rilke is writing a sonnet in rhymed iambic pentameter verse, I will write something close to that pentameter verse, although it's a little freer in English because the difference between 1920 and 1990, for example. And then with the rhymes, English is much poorer in rhymes than some other languages. So I would do slant rhymes for that, and that worked really well. Then with Catullus, as another example, he has this delicious verse form called hendecasyllabics that Robert Frost imitated in one wonderful poem of his, called For Once Then Something. But I've been fascinated with that Robert Frost poem for decades. And I thought maybe it would be possible to translate Catullus into his original meter, this hendecasyllabics that go bum, 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 ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, bum. So my obligation is not to the literal meaning, but it's to reproduce the music of the original, staying as close to the meaning as I possibly can. Maybe changing the metaphor if I have to in a drastic situation, or becoming a little looser toward one word than another word. But my obligation, my devotion, is to balance that music and meaning till they come to a point where I'm reading the poem as an English poem. It makes sense. It makes really good sense, and its music is beautiful to my ear. When that happens, there's a moment that I can recognize because I've experienced it so many times. It's like what Yeats said about when he knows that a poem is finished. He says, it's like I can feel it as if a box is clicking shut. So it's like that. It's a very discrete experience. I know that this is it. This is done.
Well, I mean, just to put that together with something you said earlier, you said, you never have doubt when you have this feeling that a project has truly been given to you. And then here you're saying, when a project is finished, when it's like this box clicking shut. I just wanted to point out that, like, what a gift that is for you as an artist to have such conviction in your work, and also to have a real conviction about when your work is finished. I think these are things that artists struggle with, and it's wonderful that you sort of intuitively have such a clear idea of both the beginning and the commitment and the end.
I think this is a really good advertisement for meditation practice.
Go on.
Yeah. Well, because when you're practicing meditation, especially a lot of hours per day and a lot of days per week and a lot of weeks per year, you get to be very tuned in to what's happening in your mind, because you've spent hour after hour after hour being bored to tears by the repetitive neuroses that are going on, and those eventually drain away until there's only the thought happening without any judgment. So you get to know when these things pop up immediately, like, oh, there's a book here. I'm going to do Jesus next, or I'm going to do Homer. That's so exciting, and it's a definite thing. I know it's there, but without being tuned in. For instance, before I did all those years of meditation practice, possibly that insight might have been buried by thoughts like my resentment at my mother for not teaching me to tie my shoes at the age of 3, or a pain in my back or something. It would get buried by the trivial. So I think people who have looked at their minds with that kind of intensity have a really fine tool if they're artists or writers.
Yeah. Well, speaking of intuition, it seems like one of your most intuitive projects was the Tao Te Ching. You said earlier that sometimes you departed from the text completely. And just for those who may not know what the Tao Te Ching is, it's one of the founding documents of Taoism. It's these 81 brief, enigmatic chapters. I mean, the whole book you could probably read if you wanted to in about 30 minutes. This is a book that's been translated hundreds and hundreds of times. By the time you translated it
103 times before I did
it. Right. 103 just in English. I mean, just English translations 103 times. I've read that the Tao Te Ching is the most translated book in the world other than the Bible. And I would say it was my introduction to your work as well. As a friend of mine named Herb, and Herb wrote a great question that we're going to ask later in the show. But when I was a freshman in college, he handed me this little book. I'd never heard of it. I read it. I was immediately taken by it. I was just, it truly, to use a cliche, blew my mind. And that was my introduction to you. And I guess I just kind of wanted to ask you about kind of the way that you use intuition in that. And also just, I guess my first question though is, Why do you think that book became the kind of cultural phenomenon that it did? I mean, it sold over 1 million copies. It really put you on a map as a kind of cultural and literary figure. What is it about that particular work of yours that you think made it take off in society the way it did?
I can only cite people's reactions in some of the reviews and in what people would tell me after readings, and that is that they seem to think that it was clearer and deeper than any of the other versions that they read. I hope so. That's what I was trying to do. Another thing was that when I was working on it, I noticed that everybody, when they were talking about the master, which is Lao Tzu's figure of somebody who lives in complete harmony with the way things are, who isn't led astray by his or her own opinions. So that master was always translated as he when it came to the pronoun. And that seemed so ridiculous to me, especially because the Tao Te Ching, of all the great texts in world religion, is by far the most feminine, the most female. Even it says it explicitly: stick to the female, know the male, but stick to the female. And its figure of the master is at least as much of a woman as it is a man. So what I decided on was alternating chapters about the master. I would say he in one chapter, and the next chapter I would say she. And this was, it turned out this was really meaningful to, thousands or hundreds of thousands of women who felt seen and recognized by that little change. That had something to do with it as well.
Yeah. And it only took you go ahead.
I have a story.
Yeah, please.
Are you interested in another story about
I'm interested in all your stories, Stephen.
about how the Tao Te Ching happened?
Yeah, please.
So I was working on my money karma at the time. I had been living in Zen centers where I had free room and board because I had given money to the Zen master, given all my money to the Zen master. And so I was living on $3,000 for 5 or 6 years after I left my Zen teacher. My parents kindly offered me that, and it was very, very kind of them because I had no idea how to earn a living. And when my first Rilke book came out, I was thrilled because I got an advance of $2,500. That was a king's ransom to me. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing. But I wasn't getting more than that for the Rilke books, even though they later sold a huge amount of copies. But my girlfriend at the time said, I want to have a talk with you. I know you are not interested in money. I know you're great examples are the Buddha and Jesus and the Zen masters who didn't have any money. But if you want to be a writer, you're going to have to accept the money that comes back from sales of your books. And if you don't solve your money karma problem, your books aren't going to be able to go out to many people because you won't be able to accept what comes back. So that made sense to me. I resisted it for a couple of weeks, but that made sense. So I decided to do a 100-day mini retreat on money karma. I had done a couple of 100-day maxi retreats with my Zen master, which meant going off by yourself, doing 100 days of meditation, 20 hours a day. You sleep in 2 sessions of 2 hours apiece. And a lot of very interesting things happened during those 100 days. Anyway, so this was a 100-day mini retreat between midnight and 3 a.m. every night. I would sit on the rug in the living room and meditate and hold the question of how can I earn money in an ethical way.
Yeah.
So on the 95th day of this 100-day retreat, I had a vision of Yoda from Star Wars. He was there for like 30 seconds in front of me, almost tangible. Second night, Yoda came back. Third night, Yoda. So after the 100 days were over, I started to think, what could this mean? That vision of this character, and it seemed to me that I could write a very free version of the Tao Te Ching and call it the Book of the Force, and translate the Tao as the Force and have a commentary by Yoda, and that would be really, really commercial. So I started to work on it, and I did about a third of the book before I was able to contact George Lucas's people. And I spoke to his secretary and told her the idea and asked her to speak to him. And he got back to me and said, it's an intriguing idea, but I don't want my characters associated with any particular tradition.
Wait, George Lucas himself said that?
Yeah. Well, his secretary told me.
His secretary relayed it. Got it. That is great.
So I, at that point, was fine with it and changed directions. And instead of a commentary by Yoda, it would have a commentary by me. And instead of the Force, it would be the Tao. And that's how the project started. It's how I felt so free about throwing out something that's less insightful, because it was going to be that kind of book, a little, lighthearted. But I was very happy that that the book got done the way it did, because during the meditation, I had a sense of shimmering light behind Yoda, and that there was some kind of way that I was going to overcome my resistance to earning money through that. And in fact, that's the way it happened. So I got, they paid me the largest amount of money that a translation had ever gotten, and it made there was an article about it in the financial section of the New York Times, if you can believe that. Well, so that after that, I didn't have a problem earning money.
Oh my God. That is amazing. Well, all right. So tonight, everybody who's listening to this show is going to go meditate for 3 hours and try to see a vision of
100 days.
100 days. Oh, sorry, 100 days. But eventually, Wall Street Yoda will appear to you as well. So on that, it's an interesting thing about the Tao and how kind of like for you, at least for a time, it was sort of such a free concept, a concept that you might have even have merged with your understanding of the Force in Star Wars. There is a thing that you have to do over and over in your work, and that is define the undefinable and come to terms with literally things that are just some of the most difficult and subtle and mysterious concepts in the history of civilization. This is like, so Dharma and yoga, say in the Gita, or God, the God of Job, the God of Jesus, very different. What are they? The Tao and the Tao Te Ching. And, these are very, very, very subtle concepts. And I'm just wondering, like, First, I'm wondering how you do it. And the second part of that question is, I'm wondering if, kind of having defined the undefinable, say, in the Tao Te Ching, and then you move on to kind of defining the God of Jesus or defining the God that you see in the Gita, like, does having worked through the spiritual concepts in previous books help you come to terms then with other difficult concepts later?
No, it's the understanding I gained through Zen practice and doing the work of Byron Katie. The books themselves are basically, dancing with a consciousness that I love and am attracted to. I think that the problems of each particular book are so special and individual that they don't give me a pattern for the next book, because that's different problems. So, just keeping the mind open, staying in the don't know mind, and everything is provided through that, because you're not imposing yourself onto the project. You're not, in the same way, somebody who's living in harmony with the way things are doesn't impose his or her preferences onto reality. Reality is the preference. whatever happens is the preference. Whatever happens is understood as the will of God. And that, may sound frightening, but it's the opposite. It's really where serenity lies. I should mention also, since we're talking about the book, the Tao Te Ching, that, but in my opinion, by far the best book that's been written about that, and it's my favorite book in the whole world, actually, is the book I helped Byron Katie write, called A Thousand Names for Joy. And it's anybody who's interested in the Tao Te Ching might do well to get a copy of A Thousand Names for Joy and read each chapter in the Tao Te Ching alongside the corresponding chapter in A Thousand Names for Joy. That's something I highly recommend.
Yeah, I've been resisting, asking you about your wife's work simply because we only have so much time. But I know how important that work is to so many people. Obviously, I know what incredible respect you have for that work. But it just seems like the two of you have just a kind of quite singular spiritual partnership.
Well, I experience it as miraculous. And she's the most deeply realized human being I've ever met. And I have the utmost respect for her and for her work.
Yeah. And do you think that A Thousand Names for Joy is, for those who are interested in her work, that's the best place to start, or?
No, if they're interested in her work, Loving What Is the handbook for the work. So, and they don't even have to, get a copy of Loving What Is. They can go straight to thework.com. Everything about the work is there for free. You don't have to give your email. You don't have to give anything. It's all there available. Katie really feels strongly about keeping it available free of charge for anybody who is interested.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, we'll put a link to that in the chat. Now, Stephen, I mean, you are somebody who is quite alive to the energy of people around you. Certainly, the relationship you have with your wife, she has a consciousness that made a powerful, powerful impression upon you and still does. I'm wondering, though, about the consciousness of the authors that you translate. Sometimes when I'm reading a book, I mean, this happens quite regularly, I have a distinct feeling of who the person is and a kind of an encounter with that person. I wonder, like someone like Homer, whose work I've read so much over the years, I feel like I sort of know what he looks like, and I have a feeling what it might be like to look at him and talk to him. I'm wondering, somebody for whom the energy of others and the energy that's embedded in a work is so important to you. Could you kind of describe what this might be for you? What are your encounters like when you feel like you're encountering the real Jesus, or as Jesus speaks to you, or the real Lao Tse, the real author of the Gita? Is there any way to describe those kinds of encounters with a consciousness?
With Lao Tse, I felt what I used to call an umbilical connection, which is why I could, in good conscience, with a sense of integrity, begin that book, even though I don't know Chinese. And I know a lot of languages, German and Hebrew and all sorts of other ones, but I didn't learn Chinese for that. I didn't think I had to. So that may seem arrogant, but it was what I was feeling, that umbilical connection. With Homer, or with Rilke, it's not so much the spirit of the author as the music, because the music is the heart of it for a poet. And for example, when I first discovered Rilke and read all of the translations, I was, famished for anything by Rilke. The translations were simply dead. The people had no sense of the power of a line of English verse. They were just doing rote translations and ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. It was dull. It was as if a third-rate disciple of Wordsworth in 1820 were trying to write an epic. It just wasn't working. So the music is what I tune into, and if it's kind of like stereo, I listen to the words in Greek, for example, or Hebrew, and then eventually, maybe after a few seconds, maybe after 10 minutes, an equivalent music will arise in my other ear that corresponds to the original music. And maybe the meaning is too far away from the original meaning to use that particular line. But then I noodle it and stay with it and think about it and don't think about it. And finally, something will pop up that has that perfect balance between meaning and music. And if that's the spirit of an author, that's what I am so aware of.
Yeah. I love, I've just heard you talk about, especially with Lao Tzu, like the consciousness of that person, whoever that person was. And maybe it was a woman, frankly. I mean, nobody really knows. But the idea that there was a human being, at least a single human being, who is standing behind that work, and you can sense that person. And I find that idea, to me, that's what reading is all about. It's like it allows you to participate in the mind of another person who might have figured out things or reached a level of spirituality and understanding about life that is unattainable to you without that book. And like, that is why books to me are the greatest treasures that we have.
Yes, I understand that. And, from the first moment that I discovered Rilke through my beloved girlfriend, I know who's not ignorant of tough love. But as soon as I discovered Rilke, I felt here is my teacher, my teacher for the moment. And eventually, as with Job, I discovered that what I was most interested in and most hungry for could not be gotten from a book, from words at all, even the most magnificent words. So that's when I realized I had to do some serious practice if I was serious about understanding.
Great. So I've got a few more questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience here. We're going to go a little bit over the allotted time, but I just had so much I wanted to get to. Just a little bit of a turn in the conversation. I've heard you talk about the importance of waiting in your process. And, Rilke, in Letters to a Young Poet, he says, time means nothing to an artist. Summer does come, but only to those who are patient. And this idea of being in touch with your unconscious, and just basically, I think, the idea of knowing when something is truly ripe. And I think I've seen, the way that you talk about your work, there's a kind of waiting for the right project. There's also, when you finish a project, you don't publish everything right away. There's a waiting for the right moment to publish it. There's just this very intuitive sense of timing within you, and a sort of, I think, fearless patience about your entire process. And I just wanted to hear you talk about the importance of waiting to any creative person.
Well, yeah, this is a theme that goes through a lot of the books that I've admired and worked with, from Letters to a Young Poet. Rilke gives some excellent advice there on the subject of solitude and waiting. And the Tao Te Ching even says at one point, can you remain unmoving till the right answer arises by itself? Mm-hmm. That's it's a beautiful thing if you can learn how to do that. I was really lucky because the kind of meditation practice that I stumbled into was in Zen is called koan practice. A koan is an existential statement that puts the mind into a state of unknowing. It's a question that you cannot answer with your rational mind. Mm-hmm. So you sit there in meditation, questioning that, what could be the answer here, questioning it, and eventually your mind becomes a question without any words, and that's where you want to be. So you can spend, a long time, hours of this, weeks, months. But the point is to practice and experience that mind that is totally open to reality, and that's that's the jackpot.
Right. All right. And so for the final part of the conversation, I just want to have some thoughts about kind of, looking at your entire oeuvre together and kind of what you've learned or seen from it. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of religious strife in the history of humanity, and there still is today. People divided on the basis of religion. And I'm wondering, having gone through so many of these foundational religious texts, what is it that you see that they have in common? I mean, you said a moment ago that you feel like you're sort of encountering and surrendering yourself to kind of whatever the individual consciousness is of each work. But at the same time, I'm wondering, are there things you see about human nature and about the kind of spiritual instinct that are uniform across all these great works?
Sure. Even through works like Homer, which you wouldn't think that's a spiritual work. The Iliad, there's so much violence and killing, et cetera. But among other things that I found incredibly powerful and spiritual, there's an ending where the old king, Priam, whose city is about to be destroyed forever, and his women sold into slavery, etc., comes to beg for the dead body of his son Hector from Achilles, who has killed Hector. And it's possibly the most moving scene in all of literature. It's a moment of forgiveness where violence just lingers just behind the scenes. Very, very powerful. So I found, even in something as non-spiritual, quote unquote, as the Iliad, there's that attracted me so deeply. But I've met people in all sorts of religious traditions who have lived a life of surrender. My Bedouin guide through the Sinai, or a Benedictine nun that I was in love with when I was 23, who was just such a
another love story. Another
woman. Yeah. So, and then in Buddhism, which produces so many really fine people, fine, decent, upstanding people. And I haven't met any practicing Hindus, but I'm sure there are. Well, one of my great teachers is Ramana Maharshi, who died in 1950. So he was certainly there. So, it's I think it's more difficult to get to that place of total surrender through religions that are really attached to a sacred text. But it's possible. I think it's really hard. The hardest is being attached to the Bible, which is so contains so many different kinds of things in it, and a lot that is not helpful. But yeah, so I do think that some traditions are more likely to produce kinds of human beings that we admire, and some traditions less. But they all, for somebody talented and sincere and hungry for the truth, they're all ways of attaining it.
And we live in an age of science and technology where, scientists are, and, the engineers and the machine makers of the world not only have great financial power, but also have great cultural capital. What do you see as the fate of these spiritual traditions and these spiritual texts in today's world? Is there a continuing hunger, and will there forever be one? Or is there some way that some of these great spiritual texts just sort of begin to recede? I don't know, as we become more scientific, if that's possible?
Well, of course, I don't know, but I would bet that there's a part of human nature that automatically longs for the truth and longs for happiness. Ramana said all human beings long to be happy, and in one way or another, people will always be discovering texts that are the lived experience of some extraordinary human beings. So I think that there'll always be that hunger and always be that discovery for people who have that kind of temperament. The Tao Te Ching and the Bhagavad Gita, however, both say that for people who are advanced in the practice, mature human beings, they no longer need spiritual texts. They can put away a spiritual text. The Buddha himself said, "My teaching is only temporarily. It's as if you try to cross a river in a raft, and then when you get to the other side, you take the raft and put it on your head and walk around with it. That's not the way the raft's supposed to be used. When you go to the other side, you forget the raft. You're already there." Yeah. So it's like that.
Wow. All right. One last question from me before we go to audience questions. The story in the Bible of Jacob wrestling with God. That's just been such a powerful image for me my whole life. I've always loved that story, and that it's a very brief part of that story, but it's just that image. And for me, what it's always meant is I've always felt a calling towards stories and literature and writing. And that is my way of wrestling with the divine and this feeling that, like, for me, if there's some kind of victory or a temporary victory or a kind of withstanding, lasting through the night in this wrestling, it's that I'm able to kind of wrestle into words something meaningful and something that speaks to me. And sort of, I find a great relief in coming to terms, literally coming to terms with things in words. And there's a great psychological benefit in putting down and being able to put down into words kind of what you mean about some of these mysteries about life and what they mean to you. I just wanted to kind of put that back over to you, just about, does that, him wrestling with God, does that kind of for you strike a chord as something that you have been doing as well in your career?
Yes. I think of books like the Gospel According to Jesus and the Book of Job, which involved many years of wrestling for me. But when I think of that story and that metaphor of wrestling with God, where my mind goes is wrestling with ideas of God, with your own conceptions of God, and because if you actually spend a lot of time going deep into the concept of God, you realize there's nothing there to wrestle with. But we have all sorts, so many concepts of God, so many different kinds of attributes that we lay onto it, that what's most important for that spiritual practice is to shed these concepts the way a snake sheds his skin, and get down to reality. So that's what I think of with Jacob and the angel. It's a necessary process of getting rid of everything that you feel that's making you comfortable about God. Reading Job is a good practice too, because you can't be comfortable with it. It's beyond that. It's so vast. But yeah, it's a beautiful story and a powerful metaphor.
All right, let's go to a couple questions from the audience here. This is a question from Renee. How does one practice Zen completely? You have 30 seconds. No, I'm just
One does. That's my answer.
One just does.
One just does. If you're serious about understanding the truth, then naturally you give yourself to a practice that's as powerful as you can stand, given your courage and your physical condition and your age, et cetera, et cetera. But when I discovered there was something like Zen, like a spiritual tradition like that, I can't tell you how elated I was, and I just gave everything of myself. There was nothing more important in life. I didn't even read. I didn't write for those 7 years. So it was, again, going back to waiting until I had a very grounded and vivid experience of the truth.
And what does the practice look like now, today? Like, it's Friday afternoon or Friday morning where you are. Like, what is it going to look like for the rest of today, for example?
Nothing special.
Okay.
Going out for a latte, reading, sitting out in the garden. Since Katie is away for the weekend, I have all this time to just see what's going on in my mind, or see what kind of poem I want to read next, or jot down something that I've understood. Yeah, it's just like anybody else on a free day, I would think.
I feel like a lot of people are going to hear this and just skip over the 7 years of intensive study and just go straight to the latte and the book.
You could do worse.
All right, let's take just one more question. Now, this is a question from an old friend, one of my oldest friends. His name is Herb, and he is the one who put your copy of the Tao Te Ching into my hands when we were in college. And Herb's
thank you, Herb.
Yep. Herb says, how did you arrive at the commentary in your footnotes on the Tao Te Ching? The comments are so spot on, but what a massive thing to comment on the Tao.
Well, there's a Yiddish word for that, chutzpah. So I love writing those notes because it's such a short form. You can be as witty as you like, and it's not going to bore anybody. If Herb liked the notes in the Tao Te Ching, he would also like the notes in the second book of the Tao, which I had so much fun with. So yeah, I'm glad he loved them. I remember getting into that space of writing the notes, and I could immediately feel a kind of a laughter bubbling up that never made it into sound. But I had that experience of, oh, great, I get to write another note. That's going to be so much fun.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Herb. All right. So, Stephen, we're going to wrap with one last question from me. And I recognize that this is just sort of an impossible question to answer, but I'm going to try anyway. If you could kind of look back at your whole career and all the work that you've done and all the many readers that you've had, but just imagine if you can somehow kind of add all the readers together and add all your work together and just put into words, if you can, what is your fondest hope? What kind of would you most wish that readers across the world would have taken from your work, if you could kind of put that into a small package?
I would love it if a reader finds his or her life changed as the result of reading my books. All of these great texts, or at least the greatest of them, are meant to help you live your life. And even if that help is not so huge, even if it's a moment of pleasure at the way a line in a poem sounds, I love that. However a person benefits from a book of mine is just gives me great pleasure. It can be a big benefit or a tiny benefit, but I did it for myself. I didn't do it for any of my readers, but I just love it if readers have something of the experience of fulfillment that I have when I write a book.
That's what a wonderful sentiment. And I would just tell you, since you happen to be sitting here with a reader of yours, I mean, for me, it's not only done those things, but I would just say, in the dark times of life when I feel adrift and I feel like there's nothing to grab onto, I feel like your works have been something to steady me in dark times. And I feel like, what can I believe in? What can I reach out to? And often I find myself reaching out for one of your books. So it's been invaluable.
That gives me great pleasure. I'm so glad that you connected with those books and with me. And that's why I said yes to your invitation.
Well, thank you. Well, it has been the honor and the pleasure of a lifetime, Stephen Mitchell. Thank you for coming on The Thoughtful Bro. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry I didn't get to all your questions, but thank you, everybody, for being here. And Stephen, what a treat.
To me, too.
Great. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time on Thoughtful Bro.